May 3, 1945. 2:17 p.m. Trent Park, North London. Rain tapped against leaded windows. General Major Dietrich Bassen pressed his ear against the brass ventilation grate in the library wall. His fingers, still bearing the tan line where his Knight's Cross once hung, gripped the polished mahogany paneling. Below, in the servants' corridor, two British guards were talking. Bassen expected to hear hatred, plans for revenge, the vicious mockery of defeated enemies. What he heard instead would undo everything he believed about his enemy. One guard was complaining about the rationing. His wife couldn't get sugar. The other guard laughed. Then, incredibly, they began discussing whether the German prisoners should get extra cigarettes for good behavior. Not as manipulation, not as strategy, but because, as one guard put it, they're men, aren't they? Same as us. Bassen pulled away from the grate. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something far more destabilizing. For the first time since his capture, he wondered if everything he'd been told was a lie. If you're interested in the untold stories of World War II that reveal what people are really made of under pressure, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Because what happened next at Trent Park wasn't just about intelligence gathering. It was about what happens when men raised on propaganda encounter a truth they can't ignore. The collapse had been swift. By spring 1945, the Worm Act was shattered. Elite generals who'd commanded divisions across North Africa and Europe found themselves in Allied custody. These weren't young conscripts. They were general majors and general lieutenants. Men like Dietrich Bassen, Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, Ludwig Krull. Generals who'd studied Clausewitz and dined with field marshals. Men who'd commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They expected interrogation. Sleep deprivation, perhaps torture. That was warfare. That was what happened to captured enemy officers. The Gestapo had demonstrated it thoroughly. German intelligence had its methods. Surely the British had theirs. Instead, they were loaded onto lorries and driven through the English countryside to a mansion north of London. Trent Park wasn't what they expected. The estate sprawled across 400 acres of manicured grounds. The main house was Georgian, elegant. Its rooms fitted with Persian rugs and oil paintings. There were libraries stocked with German literature, smoking rooms with leather chairs and decanters of whiskey, tennis courts, walking paths through gardens that were even in wartime Britain meticulously maintained. The Germans were given private rooms, good beds, meals that, while not lavish, exceeded what most British civilians were eating under rationing. There was wine with dinner, cigars afterward. Guards who were professional, even courteous. It was utterly confusing. For 2 years, these generals had absorbed a consistent narrative about their enemies. The British were decadent, weak. Their empire was crumbling. Their people had gone soft from luxury. When German soldiers fell into British hands, they could expect the worst. That's what the propaganda films had shown. That's what whispered reports from the Eastern Front suggested happened everywhere. Bassen had believed it. Not because he was stupid. He held a degree in military history from Berlin, but because nothing in his experience contradicted it. The Nazis had shown what total war looked like. Ruthlessness was strength. Mercy was weakness. Any nation serious about victory would treat captured enemies as the Gestapo treated resistance fighters. The British had signed the Geneva Convention. Yes, but that was just paper. Under real pressure, under total war, surely civilized rules collapsed. Everyone knew that. It was obvious. Except here at Trent Park, surrounded by comfort and civility, the narrative didn't quite fit. The generals told themselves it was psychological warfare, a softening up period before the real interrogation began. The British were clever. They'd lull the prisoners into complacency, then strike with questions when defenses were down. That had to be it. But weeks passed. The interrogations never came. Instead, there was routine breakfast at 8, exercise periods, time in the library, discussions about military theory with other captured officers. The guards maintained discipline but without cruelty. When General Lieutenant Krull complained about the quality of the coffee, an absurd complaint given Britain's dire rationing, a sergeant actually apologized and said he'd see what could be done. It was maddening. The Germans needed the British to behave like enemies. Like the Nazis had taught them, enemies behaved. This courtesy, this almost kindness, didn't fit into any category they understood. What they didn't know was that Trent Park had a secret. Every room was bugged. Microphones hidden in light fixtures behind paintings inside the very walls themselves. British intelligence officers sat in a monitoring room with headphones and German to English dictionaries transcribing every conversation. The operation was called Cockade, though the Germans wouldn't learn its name for decades. The whole estate was one massive listening device. The comfort wasn't kindness. It was strategy. Relaxed prisoners talked. Men who felt safe dropped their guard. In their private conversations with fellow officers, the generals discussed military secrets, strategic assessments, and most valuable of all, their true opinions about the Nazi regime. But the microphones picked up something else, too. They caught what the British Guard said when they thought no one was listening. Bassen discovered the ventilation grates by accident. The library's heating system ran through brass ducts that connected to the servants' corridors below. Sound traveled. If you pressed your ear to certain spots, you could hear conversations from the ground floor. He wasn't spying initially. He was simply reading near the wall when he heard voices. Curiosity led him closer. Then the content of what he heard made him stay. Two guards were discussing their families. One had a daughter who just started school. The other was worried his son was getting into trouble back in Birmingham. Ordinary concerns. Normal fathers talking. Then the conversation shifted. Shame about the German civilians. One guard said, "What do you mean? In the cities, the bombing, my cousins in the RAF, says whole neighborhoods just gone. Women and children." There was a pause. It's war in it. Still, they didn't start it. Not the civilians. Bassen had frozen. These were his enemies. His family was in one of those bombed cities. These men served the air forces that dropped the bombs and they were expressing sympathy. It made no sense. He started listening regularly. The guards never knew he was there and he heard conversation after conversation that challenged everything he thought he knew about his enemy. One afternoon, 3 guards discussed what should happen after Germany surrendered. One argued for harsh reparations. Make them pay for what they've done. My street in Liverpool got hit in '41. Whole row of houses gone. Children dead. Make the Germans feel what we felt. But another disagreed. Starving them won't help. Creates resentment. We tried that after the Great War. Look what happened. Versailles planted the seeds for this war. You want to do it again. So we just forgive and forget. I didn't say that. War criminals get tried. But ordinary Germans, the ones who didn't have a choice, different story. The third guard, older, perhaps a veteran of the previous war, said something that stuck with Bassen for decades. We're fighting the Nazis, not the German people. There's a difference. My son's unit liberated a camp near Bremen. The local Germans didn't know what was happening there, or they told themselves they didn't know. Fear does that to people. You believe that? That they didn't know. I believe some didn't. I believe some were too afraid to look. I believe most people given the choice between being a hero and protecting their family choose their family. That doesn't make them Nazis, just makes them human. Was there a difference between the German people and the Nazi state? Bassen had never considered it. The propaganda had been absolute. The German Volk and the Nazi Party were one, indivisible. In Volk, Einrei, ein Führer. To question the party was to betray the nation. To separate yourself from the movement was to become an enemy of Germany itself. But these British guards, men who'd actually fought Germans who'd seen their cities bombed and their people killed, were making distinctions that German officers had been forbidden to make. They were pausing responsibility, acknowledging that soldiers following orders were different from ideologues choosing cruelty, that a nation could be separated from its regime. The Nazi system had never allowed such nuance. Either you were loyal to the party or you were a traitor. There was no middle ground, no space for partial allegiance, no recognition that someone could love Germany while hating what Germany had become. But here were British soldiers, the supposed enemy, offering Germans a complexity that their own regime had denied them. Another time, Bassen overheard a discussion that shook him. 2 guards were talking about prisoners they'd processed earlier in the war. One mentioned a German pilot who'd been shot down over Kent in 1940 during the height of the Battle of Britain when German bombers were pounding London nightly. Youngster, maybe 19, looked even younger, terrified would shoot him. His message had come down in a field. Farmer found him trying to hide in a barn. Leg broken, face cut up, kept saying, "Nishkisen, Nishisen, don't shoot." Yeah. Kid thought would execute him right there. Couldn't understand why we called an ambulance. Kept looking at us like we were playing some trick. Like we'd wait until he relaxed, then pull out pistols. Did he speak English? Bit enough to say thank you when we gave him tea and a cigarette while waiting for the medics. Strange thing was his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the cup. Not from the injuries, From fear. Absolute terror. Whatever they told him about what would happen if he got captured, it was bad enough that he thought a broken leg was the least of his problems. Of course not. Gave him tea and a cigarette. Sent him to AP camp. Farm family sent him biscuits while he was recovering. Wife wrote too. Asked after him. Germans had killed her nephew at Dunkirk, but she still wanted to know if the boy was all right. Some people are just built different. Or maybe they're built the same as everyone else. And we're all capable of seeing the person behind the uniform when we're forced to. Hard to hate someone when you sat with them while they drink tea and cry for their mother. He right after the war. He did actually twice. Once right after V-Day, thanking us then again a few years later. Lives in Hamburg now. Training to be a teacher. Teaching English. Ironically said he wanted to build bridges. Reckons if an English farmer's wife could show him mercy after her nephew died, he could spend his life helping Germans and Brits understand each other. You keep the letters? I do. Wife keeps them in a drawer with our son's school certificates, says they remind her that even in the worst of times, people can be decent. They talked about the former enemy pilot the way they'd talk about a nephew with something close to affection. The guard even kept the letters. These men had every reason to hate. Britain had been bombed nightly during the Blitz. Their cities had burned. Their people had died. German bombs had killed British children. V-1 rockets had torn through neighborhoods. Families had been obliterated. And yet here were British soldiers expressing not hatred but something closer to understanding, even pity, even in their way a strange pride that the young German pilot had turned his life toward reconciliation. Bassen couldn't process it. These men had every reason to hate. Britain had been bombed nightly during the Blitz. Their cities had burned. Their people had died. German bombs had killed British children. And yet here were British soldiers expressing not hatred but something closer to understanding, even pity. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The turning point came on a rainy evening in late May. Churchill had just announced Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. At Trent Park, the news settled over the captured generals like a shroud. They'd lost. Everything they'd fought for, everything they believed in had collapsed. Basing sat in the library ostensibly reading but really just staring at pages. That's when he heard the conversation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 4 British guards were in the corridor below. They were discussing the victory celebrations in London. One described the crowds in Trafalgar Square. The joy, the relief, the sense that finally after 6 years of total war, it was over. Then the conversation shifted in a way that would change everything for Bassen. So what happens to them? One guard asked. He meant the German prisoners. Bassen pressed his ear harder against the grate. Send home eventually. Another replied, unless they are wanted for war crimes. Some of these SS types will hang, but most will go back. What about the officers here? The generals. Most of these officers aren't criminals, a third voice said. Bassend recognized it. The older sergeant who'd spoken about treating prisoners with dignity before. Just soldiers did their duty, followed orders same as we did. My brother wasn't just doing his duty, the first guard said, and his voice had an edge now. Raw, recent grief. He died at Dunkirk. German machine gun cut him down on the beach. 23 years old, going to be a doctor. Had a girl he was going to marry. All gone in 3 seconds because some German soldier decided to follow orders. The corridor went silent. Bassen held his breath. This was it. This was where the mask would slip, where the professional courtesy would crack and reveal the hatred underneath. This young guard had lost his brother. He had every right to rage, to demand vengeance. And these generals, including Bassen himself, were responsible. Their orders, their strategies, their war. Then the older guard, the sergeant spoke, I'm sorry about your brother, lad. Truly, that's a wound that never quite heals. I lost mates in the last war. Still think about them. Then how can you say they're just soldiers? They killed James, killed thousands of our boys. Because they were, the sergeant said quietly, soldiers fighting for their country. Same as your brother was. Same as we all are. If you'd been born in Hamburg instead of Manchester, you might have been holding that machine gun at Dunkirk. Wouldn't make you evil. Would make you German. That's not I know it doesn't feel fair. War isn't fair. Your brother shouldn't be dead. But holding grudges against every German in uniform won't bring him back, and it won't make us better than what we've been fighting against. Another voice joined in. Younger but thoughtful, the sergeants, right? I've walked past their quarters. Heard them talking. They don't act like fanatics. They don't rant about Hitler or Germania. They act like defeated soldiers, lost, confused, trying to figure out what comes next, wondering if their families are alive. Wondering what Germany even is now. That's different from being evil. The first guard, the one who'd lost his brother, was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thick. So, we just forgive them. Pretend it didn't happen. We treat them according to the laws of war, the older sergeant said firmly. With dignity, even in defeat, especially in defeat. That's what separates us from the Nazis. They brutalized prisoners, murdered them, worked them to death. We don't because we're better than that. And we prove we're better by our actions, not our words. My brother would have wanted revenge. Maybe. Or maybe he'd want you to be the man he remembered. The decent bloke who helped neighbors, who was kind to children, who didn't let hate poison him. I can't speak for your brother, but I can tell you that becoming cruel to honor the dead is a poor tribute. We beat the Nazis by being stronger and smarter, but we'll only win the peace by being better. A fourth guard who'd been silent until now added, think of it this way. When these Germans go home, they'll tell people how they were treated. If we torture them, brutalize them, they'll say Britain is as bad as the Gestapo. But if we treat them fairly, feed them, send them home healthy, they'll have to admit we were better. That's how you change minds. Not through cruelty, through example. Bassen pulled back from the grate, his vision blurred. He gripped the edge of the reading table. Everything he'd been taught said that mercy was weakness. That only strength, brutal, overwhelming strength, commanded respect. The propaganda films had shown Allied soldiers as soft, undisciplined, too moral to do what war required. But what he just heard wasn't weakness. The sergeant had lost men, probably seen horrors, and he was choosing restraint. Not because he couldn't imagine revenge. The young guard's anger proved that desire was there, but because he believed there was a higher standard, a code that applied even to enemies, especially to enemies. That night, Bassen lay in his bed, a real bed with clean sheets, and stared at the ceiling. The rain had stopped. Moonlight came through the window and the question turned over and over in his mind. If the propaganda about British cruelty was demonstrably false, and it was demonstrably false, what else had been a lie? The British government's policy toward German prisoners wasn't accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, built on cold strategic calculations that happened to align with moral principles. By 1945, Britain held approximately 400,000 German prisoners of war. Feeding them, housing them, and guarding them during a time of severe rationing and manpower shortage was an enormous burden. Yet, the British War Office insisted on strict Geneva Convention compliance. There were 4 reasons. First, security. Intelligence reports showed that brutalized prisoners became resistant, defiant, dangerous. They had nothing to lose, so they sabotaged work details and attempted escapes that endangered British guards. But prisoners treated decently became cooperative. They worked willingly on farms and infrastructure projects. They caused fewer problems. Cruelty created security risks. Decency eliminated them. Second, intelligence. Britain's secret listening operations, not just at Trent Park, but at multiple sites, depended on prisoners feeling secure enough to talk freely. A terrified prisoner says nothing useful. A tortured prisoner invents lies to make the pain stop. But a prisoner who feels safe, who's given wine and cigars, and time with fellow officers, talks about strategy, about weapons development, about which Nazi officials should be prosecuted after the war. The intelligence gathered at Trent Park alone was estimated to have shortened the war by months. Third, reciprocity. Britain still had thousands of its own soldiers in German P camps. The War Office explicitly linked prisoner treatment to diplomatic leverage. If Britain maintained Geneva standards, they had moral authority to demand Germany do the same. It didn't always work. The Nazis violated conventions regularly, but it provided a bargaining position, and it ensured that when the war ended, Britain could truthfully claim they'd honored civilized standards. Fourth, morality. Britain had signed the Geneva Convention in 1929 and ratified subsequent protocols. Churchill himself had been AP during the Boer War. He knew what captivity felt like. He insisted that British forces maintain the standards that defined them as a civilized nation. Not out of sentiment, but out of a steely determination to prove that democracy could be both strong and moral. The proof was in the numbers. German P mortality rates in British camps were under 0.3%. Prisoners received 2,800 to 3,000 calories per day, more than many British civilians. Red Cross inspectors had unrestricted access and filed reports praising conditions. German prisoners worked on British farms and helped with reconstruction. When they were finally repatriated, thousands maintained friendships with British families they'd met. This wasn't luck or kindness. It was policy. Cold, calculated, effective policy that happened to be morally defensible. For generals like Basen raised in a system where cruelty equaled strength, this was incomprehensible. The Nazis had taught that only brutality commanded respect, that enemies understood only force, that mercy was a luxury that led to defeat. But here was Britain, bombed, starved, pushed to the edge of survival, choosing restraint and winning. That contradiction couldn't be reconciled with everything Basen had been taught. So he started questioning everything else. The conversations continued through the summer. Basing found himself drawn to the ventilation grate, repeatedly listening as British guards revealed themselves to be not monsters, not weaklings, but simply men trying to do their duty honorably. He heard guards express genuine admiration for IML. They called him a worthy adversary, a soldier's soldier. One guard said he'd have been proud to serve under the Desert Fox if the man hadn't been fighting for the wrong side. They criticized Hitler viciously, called him a madman, a corporal who destroyed Germany. But they separated the Nazis from the German army. When they discussed Wehrmacht tactics, they did so with professional respect. They acknowledged German military prowess. Even as they celebrated Germany's defeat, it was so different from how German propaganda portrayed the enemy. The British weren't supposed to respect Germans. They were supposed to view all Germans as subhuman threats. The Nazis had insisted that the Allied powers saw Germans the way Germans were taught to see Slavs as inferior races to be crushed. But the evidence of his own ears contradicted this completely. One conversation particularly struck Basen. A young guard asked his sergeant whether the German generals at Trent Park knew they'd been duped, that the mansion was bugged. The sergeant laughed. If they do, they haven't said anything. Doesn't feel right though, does it? Listening in on private conversations. War isn't about feeling right, son. It's about winning. But here's the thing. Not what torture would make them say, but what they actually believe. That means we care about the truth. The Gestapo just wanted confessions. We want understanding. That's different. The young guard considered this. So after the war, when they find out we were listening, some will be angry, but some will realize we could have done much worse. We had them in our power. We chose restraint. Basen had pulled away from the grate slowly. The sergeant was right. The British had these generals completely at their mercy. They could have done anything and they'd chosen comfort, civility, and covert intelligence gathering over torture, starvation, or execution. It was a form of strength Basen hadn't been trained to recognize. By August, the generals at Trent Park knew the war was truly over. The reality was sinking in. Germany was occupied. The Nazi regime was being dismantled. Officers were being tried at Nuremberg. The world they'd known had ended. In the evenings, the captured generals talked among themselves. These conversations, of course, were also recorded. British intelligence transcripts show that by late summer, many of the generals were expressing doubts they'd never voiced during the war. Basen admitted to von Thoma one night that he'd been listening to the guards. Von Thoma, who'd commanded the Afrika Korps, nodded. I suspected as much. What have you heard? They don't hate us, Basen said quietly. They should. We bombed their cities, killed their people, but they don't hate us. They pity us. Von Thoma was silent for a long moment. Perhaps that's worse. Is it? To be hated is to be feared. To be pitied is to be seen as a fool. Were we? Basen asked. Fools. Von Thoma stared into his whiskey glass. We followed orders. We believed what we were told. We didn't ask the questions we should have asked. Is that foolishness or cowardice? Neither man had an answer. Another night, Krul joined them. The general lieutenant had been captured in 1942 and spent 3 years in British custody. He'd had longer to adjust to the cognitive dissonance. I've been thinking, Krul said, about why they treat us this way. It's not mercy. Not really. What is it then? Basen asked. Civilization. Krul said. They believe in it. Actually believe that even in war there are rules, standards, lines you don't cross. We thought that was weakness. But they've won and we've lost. So perhaps we were wrong about what strength means. Basen thought about the sergeant in the corridor. The one who'd lost men but counseled led against revenge. The one who insisted on maintaining standards precisely when it was hardest to do so. They have something we didn't, Basen said quietly. A code that applies even to enemies. Von Thoma nodded. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge now? The answer came slowly over months and years. As the generals were eventually repatriated, they carried with them a complicated truth. They'd lost the war. Their nation had committed atrocities. But their enemy had maintained standards even in victory. That contradiction between Nazi teaching and British practice forced a reckoning. Basen returned to Germany in late 1947. The country was in ruins. Cities destroyed. The economy shattered. The revelations about concentration camps had horrified even hardened Wehrmacht officers. The world they'd fought for was revealed as monstrous. But Bess also carried memories of Trent Park, of British guards who treated him with professional respect, of conversations overheard that revealed a different kind of strength, of an enemy who'd chosen restraint when they could have chosen cruelty. In post-war interviews with British historians, Basen was remarkably candid. He admitted he'd listened to the guards. He acknowledged that their conversations had shaken his certainty. When asked what he'd learned from his captivity, he said something that was quoted in multiple histories of the period. "I learned that real strength isn't the absence of mercy. It's the discipline to maintain standards even when you don't have to. The British had us in their power. They could have done anything. They chose to remain civilized. That's a strength we didn't understand." Von Thomar went further in his memoirs published in the 1950s. He wrote extensively about his time in British captivity. He described Trent Park as the place where I realized we'd been lied to about everything. He documented conversations with British officers who'd separated their respect for German military skill from their condemnation of Nazi ideology. He noted that this distinction, something the Nazi regime never allowed, was what permitted reconciliation. Krul became an advocate for British-German understanding. He worked with veterans organizations to build bridges between former enemies. He argued that the British treatment of prisoners had demonstrated that enemies could become partners if mutual respect existed. The intelligence gathered at Trent Park was declassified decades later.